recording. So, all right. I think that's good. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Ali Feldhausen. I'm the program manager at Social Builder. Social Builder is a nonprofit which creates greater tech inclusion for women. We do this through a number of different means. We do webinars, events, and we do free tech trainings to help women from underserved communities be upskilled into tech positions. It's a French-based organization, but we're also expanding to the US right now. And this event that you are at tonight is part of our webinar series, A Path Forward for Women in Tech. This webinar series is meant to highlight the different ways that nonprofits, companies, and city agencies are continuing to create a more inclusive tech ecosystem, even during the challenges of COVID. And for those that haven't been to an event before, we typically will do a panel conversation, which will be moderated by lovely Dana Lennon-Thomas tonight. And then we will, after about 30 minutes, we'll have a Q&A. So as we're discussing, if you have any resources or questions that you'd like to share, please feel free to put those in the chat. The chat is really, a space for everyone to be communicating and stay in the conversation. Obviously, keep your comments respectful, but yes, please feel free to be engaging in this conversation. We're so happy to have this event tonight. Social Builder and all the events that we've had up until now have always really had a conversation about inclusivity and diversity, but this event in particular is focusing on the many different facets of that and the many different ways that you can bring that to a tech pipeline, through a recruiting system, through developing inclusive systems in a workplace. So on that note, I think those are all my kind of top of the list things. On that note, I'd love to pass it over to our moderator, Dana, and I will let you introduce yourself.
Well, hello, I am, as she said, Dana Lennon-Thomas. I am so many things, as many of us are, right? I'm a mom, I'm a boss, I'm a wife. I'm trying to do it all, and it's just not possible, but I think I'm doing okay. I feel good tonight. This conversation is really necessary, and I'm proud to be a part of it. But I'm going to give all of you a little bit of homework. I need you to fully engage. I need you to ask those tough questions and give our panelists work. They've taken the time to log in tonight. So listen, we're going to get it out of them as whatever's necessary. We're going to do this. That's the kind of moderator I am. Paolo, feel free to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Dana. I'm very proud to be here. It's you and I had a great conversation earlier, and Ali, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Some of you may wonder, what's a white guy doing in a panel about these kinds of things? And I'm the token white guy. It's kind of nice to play that role for once. But all kidding aside, I've been working in the diversity and inclusion space for about 5 or 6 years now, and I've been interested, or I used to think I was passionate about diversity. Now that I understand it a little bit better, I realized that I was just an amateur before. But it's been really an interesting journey for me to bring my sort of scientific, technical, academic background to bear into the space. And I'm very fortunate to be working in a space that actually makes me feel like I love my work every day when I get up. I feel very excited about what I can bring to society. And it's wonderful to be here. I look forward to sharing some of the insights, and I look forward to some really tough questions, and feel free to throw some fireballs at me, because that's the only way I'm going to learn. So, and by the way, I have to say, there is a very, very dear friend of mine that I've not seen in a while. It's wonderful to see you, Claire. There she is, waving. And thank you again to everybody for being here.
Great. Genesis?
Great. Yeah. Paolo, before I introduce myself, I just want to say there's always room for allies in the diversity and inclusion space. So, we talk about inclusion, we talk about representation, and really celebrating difference. I'm a firm believer of that, and embrace you with open arms. So with that said, good evening, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. Ali, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Social Builder for including me in this important conversation. My name is Genesis Mullins. I am currently a Global Employee and Labor Relations Program Manager at Intel. For those of you who don't know, Intel Corporation is a multinational tech company based in Santa Clara, California. In my current role, I develop communication strategies. I oversee our global employee and labor external trend analysis and report. And I also drive and administer core programs that really help to facilitate consistent employee and labor relation policies and practices across our global organization. I am also wearing multiple hats. I am also at Intel currently the project manager lead for an executive women's leadership cohort called BNEW, the Black Network for Executive Women at Intel. In that role, I lead a 2-person team, really driving and implementing strategic community building, development, and progression efforts to amplify and really scale influence and just impact of Black women at Intel internally and externally. I have a background and really a passion for connecting people and talent, building strong communities, and driving public-private partnership engagements across the country. I'm a native New Yorker, originally from Harlem, born and raised, and in the context of my stint in New York City, I've worked with numerous public-private partners in the nonprofit, workforce development, as well as foundation space. I'd say that my experience expands with organizations like the 125th Street Business Improvement District in Harlem, Greater Jamaica Development Corporation in Queens, New York. Outside of the nonprofit space, I've partnered to collaborate with the workforce development department for the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development in New York City. And outside of New York, I've worked with foundations like the Boston Foundation, the GE Foundation, the Oregon Community Foundation, and the Intel Foundation. I really have a passion for the topic around diversity and inclusion. I think it's one element of how we think about the employee life cycle or engagement culture, elevating just underrepresented people in our workforce ecosystem. I am, again, native New Yorker, but right now I'm currently based in Portland, Oregon, with my dog, Mr. Barrington, and just really want to reemphasize I'm happy to be here and answer any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Erica?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Again, thank you for having me. Also, thank you, Dana, Ali, for your patience. This has been a unique time, as I have. Some of you may have noticed from the invite in the middle of transitioning roles. I initially came to this invite as a member of the New York City Economic Development Corporation and their lead, the SVP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And this week I started with New York Roadrunners as their SVP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, but still wanted to be a part of this conversation. I've been in the diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion space for about 12 years with a passion for career pipelining. I'm a trained attorney, and so really my focus and transition in this space was from kind of the compliance, the EEO piece, to much more about the lack of representation in so many industries: legal, medical, planning, engineering, tech, running, health, fitness, you name it. There's still not equity, parity, representation. And so that was probably really, as I transitioned from the legal industry about 5 years ago, really looking around to say there's not yet an industry that does not need our assistance and need greater conversation. And so with this being the wild year that it has been, the one silver lining is that we're having conversations that we have not had before. We're having necessary, uncomfortable conversations, and those are the conversations that lead to change. And again, happy to be here, happy to answer any questions. But I did want to extend a thank you to Ali and Dana for their patience with me during this last 2 weeks. So.
We thank you. We thank you. But that's a great segue into our first session for discussion because, listen, we've got 40 minutes to cover 3 major concepts, 3 brilliant panelists. How are we going to maximize this time? Well, I think we should have a very narrow focus. We're going to allow our panelists to talk to us about their professional expertise, but also, you know, their personal reflections and things that they've experienced in their lives that might help us glean some information. And I think the first thing to do to set the foundation is to have definitions of some key terms. Okay, when we talk about diversifying talent, what does that mean? Well, for this discussion, we're focused on race and gender identities. Yes, we agree age, sexual orientation, religion, etc. Those are equally important factors, but because we have limited time, our definition for diversifying talent is going to be around race and gender identity. And those words, diversity and inclusion, oh my God, they're so nuanced. They're complicated, systemic social constructs. How can we talk about this in 40 minutes? Well, that for this conversation, we're going to leave that very broad and up to our panelists to define and explain how they think of diversity and inclusion. I say it's anything that inhibits full expression or participation. So that's whatever's illegal, gender or race discriminatory behaviors or policies and practices, to conscious and unconscious bias, and even those macro and microaggressions we've heard about, both from individual humans and in organizations. Then this COVID context. Well, Erica said it, in this strange year of clarity 2020 vision, we've experienced so much between COVID and Black Lives Matter movements. It made me think of MLK's famous saying, "No one is free until we are all free." And COVID is about public health, and we're all human. So we've got to consider that factor. And yes, we're focusing on the tech sector. So think about all those traditional roles of women and the challenges that we have, but add the fact that the tech sector is notorious for having underrepresentation of women and minorities. So our panelists have no easy job. I'm going to start off with the first question, and you guys can feel free to jump in, whoever wants to answer first. But when we talk about all these things, diversity and recruiting in the COVID context today, what are some ways that organizations have been approaching this different time that none of us have experienced before? Where can we start?
Okay, so I'll kick us off, and I'll start by calling out the elephant in the room, as you will. You know, I think the pandemic has further unveiled the gross inequities that have already existed for some of the most marginalized people in our communities, whether or not you're Black. It's hard for me, a woman of color who also identifies as being a person with a disability, to separate the context of being all of those things and understanding its impacts in a COVID environment, especially in tech when there is constant underrepresentation, without considering that gamut of identity presence. And so COVID has unleashed this huge economic recession that has really hit women the hardest, with especially high levels of job loss amongst Black women and Latinx women. There was a report that was released by McKinsey Co. fairly recently within Q3, and there's a statistic that says 1 in 4 women are considering downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce due to the coronavirus. Where I think we, from a company context, taking my Intel hat off, speaking broadly for companies, nonprofit organizations, where there's an opportunity is to really double down on just pipeline building. How are we investing in community organizations, academic institutions that are really committed to driving upskilling of individuals who can compete in a market where underrepresentation exists amongst women in tech, and where there is an emphasis that's needed on skilling up people to be prepared for workforce of the future. I think pipeline development, doubling down on creating accessible opportunities for underrepresented minorities in the context of ramping in new talent to organizations like an Intel, for example, is one thing that I know companies are doing. But I think with COVID accelerating the inequities and just challenges that people are facing in the workforce context, we have opportunities in the public and private sector to just double down and emphasize the importance of that pipeline development.
Absolutely.
Thanks. I'll jump in. And I'd say something interesting that you said is that I think is also absolutely the investment in pipelining, career pathways, but that investment actually happens well before you actually have a job posting. It is like as being the need to be a good corporate citizen, and to actually look to develop meaningful, impactful relationships in the communities that you're serving. And then you create a symbiotic relationship. So I think that's actually one, and a lot of organizations look for I have a posting, I'm reaching out to an HBCU or tribal institution or SUNY, and I didn't get a response. And quite naturally, though folks are interested in opportunities, not many are interested in the one-hit wonders and want to know whether or not you're checking a box, meeting a quota, or really interested in valuing their student body and populations. And the other, I think, is that there's an unveiling of the need to call out what is a nice to have versus a must have for job opportunities and descriptions. Like, are we over hiring? Are we reviewing our job descriptions to see if they are calling for a master's degree when it could use a bachelor's, if they're calling for a bachelor's when it just really could focus on a skill set that's potentially developed without the degrees. And then further requiring folks to look at the language in those job descriptions to see if they are inclusive, inviting, or if they're ageist and all the other things that could potentially be possible.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all great. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate the perspectives that you both bring to the table. And I think that if I kind of take my scientist hat on and think about it from a broader level system perspective, what I'm seeing that is at the same time a little bit reassuring, but also really scary, is that people often talk about, root causes and systemic racism, et cetera. And what the pandemic really has done is that it has highlighted the incredible injustices that are happening in our society. So, here we have people of color and women that are being disproportionately impacted by COVID, while Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg together have brought in something like $250 billion in increased value, personal value for themselves. And when you look at that, we can certainly talk about, and it's incredibly important that we talk about programs like increasing pipelines and thinking about reaching out to communities, et cetera. But we have to realize that there's something really messed up, like really, really, really profoundly messed up. And one of the things that I like to bring to the table is really, again, thinking about it from a somewhat quantitative, scientific viewpoint, and really thinking about the connection between the individual experiences that people have and the kind of the high level systemic biases and racism that exist in our society, well, both sexism and racism that exist in our society. And that's, I would think, one of the more difficult things that I found is that sometimes when people focus too much on the high level problems, it becomes an excuse for ignoring what actually happens to individual people. So again, kudos to those of you that are actually doing the work on the ground with the organizations. And I mean, certainly with an organization the size of Intel, you have an opportunity to make a substantial difference. And I think it's wonderful, but I have to say, it's so important to me that people don't there's been this increased awareness. And I was surprised, in the small town in upstate New York, which has been kind of in the middle, it's a pretty red county, But in spite of that, a few months ago, there was actually a BLM march that was organized after the murder of George Floyd, and it was like, oh wow, that's great. But I'm wondering, is that going to stick? You know, is that really are people going to keep doing the right things? And again, these are, we're talking about societal problems, but ultimately they impact everybody within the workforce as well as outside, directly and indirectly. And I know Dana and I were talking earlier about the fact that women are getting, there's an interesting phenomenon, by the way. I watch a lot of Italian news because my elderly father is living with me right now. And one thing that strikes me that I don't hear in the United States, that we hear a lot in Europe, but I know it's true here, is the incredible increase in the violence and domestic abuse that women have suffered as a result of the pandemic. And why are we not talking about that? Why are we not talking about the fact that when a woman shows up for work on Zoom, she's probably having to deal with things that are 10 times as bad as anything that I have to deal with. And if you're a Black woman, it's 50 times as bad, right? So these are all things that are coming to the fore, but hopefully we'll move beyond talking about it and using that as an example to actually start breaking down some of these systems and really doing something impactful.
Well, thank you for keeping us honest. So I heard things like studies and data that has been constructed to try to address these issues. I heard that we need to prioritize, how we approach. I've heard that there's serious, deep underlying root causes, and maybe we need to focus on that first. Yeah, there's this famous quote that says, if you exclude 50% of the talent pool, then you wonder why you're having these talent issues. You're looking for talent that's not there. And I remember Wells Fargo CEO said, it's difficult to find qualified, diverse talent, and he got killed for that one. But why do these concerns still exist? What challenges are there in the way? I mean, if we already know women, they need role models, and we've got to start in the classroom, as Eric said. It starts way before. And Genesis talked about all the foundation work that she's been doing. Important and intelligent people have been working on this for decades. So adding COVID context to that, people are feeling hopeless. I want to make sure in this conversation today, we talk about some ideas that we have to really start to see the systemic change, or what needs to happen. Is there something dramatic that has to happen for us to really make a shift?
I'd love to jump in. I think that the dramatic thing has happened. My hope is that we use this as that COVID and just all of 2020 has allowed us to have conversations that we're not having, and hard truths, right? And right, we are, I think, a society that hasn't discussed racism, the institutionality of racism, right? How deeply embedded it is, and that because it is institutional, then it will take a dismantling and rebuilding. That does not happen over time, and it is not one thing. It's not what Genesis says. It's not what Paula says. It's not what it will take lots of voices and lots of hands. And so, again, what I said, that one silver lining is that the fact that we're having the conversations, it's not just conversations, and how things are showing up. How do we end up with people saying there's not qualified talent when we're talking about, for instance, Facebook, I think, has 1.7% of their technical degrees going to positions going to Black folks, when Black people are graduating and getting just computer science degrees at something at almost 7%. So, right, so you're talking about the market being there. Then the next round is if it is not explicit behavior, right, explicitly bad behavior, then we're talking about the impact of implicit bias. And I know that there's a lot of conversation around it, and people, I think, are minimizing it, but there are, we talked about it, the personal bias as well as the institutional bias, meaning it's baked right in. Somebody said that before. When you're looking for best talent or top qualified or rock star, right? What does that mean, really? And so that is that, being able to review your written systems and policies, right? Because otherwise it is, the interpersonal is fine, but the interpersonal does not change an organization, because when Genesis leaves and when I leave, when whoever leaves, if you take the interpersonal with you, you have not built in systems that are so deeply embedded that they would need to be uprooted. And I think that is in, like, we're in the space now where folks are saying, I don't care. I actually personally don't care about your social media post. Show me your board, your leadership, your commitment, and who you're doing business with, right? So that for me is where I really am quite passionate in the flashy press release thing. Sure, fine. Not interested. I really want to know what you're doing that would make it hard to tear apart. And I'm going to say this last thing, then I'm going to quit. There was a gentleman from GARE, I think it was Government Alliance on Race Equity, who said that your equity policies need to be so deeply embedded that it's like it is in a muffin that you're trying to, like if you don't want the raisin, you'd have to rip it all apart and start over, right? So something along those lines. But
Wow.
Yeah, I'll say something in respect to that that theme of collective work and responsibility in the context of how we think about retaining talent once they're in an organization, or how we think about supporting or succession planning and bringing people along in a journey of being those advocates or champions for true diversity and inclusion, being embedded in some of the systems that have been established and have been propagated by traditionally old boys networks. This is more of an anecdotal perspective, but for myself, being in tech, being again an African American woman, someone who also identifies with a disability, I find that there is this trend of protection of power, or sort of this space of making sure that you are heard, or you or I are represented, and have the stamp of making it through the ranks. When you think about how women have had to create a space for themselves in the context of tech organizations. And so this preservation of power or space has sort of trickled off this downhill effect of not having open collaboration around pain points that might exist, or challenges that might be faced, or just areas or spaces of fatigue when you often have to show up as the only person of color, or the only woman, or the only person with a differently abled approach in a room that is propagated and dictated by, again, traditionally an old boys network. And so I think one opportunity area in that context, and this is thinking about, representation in the tech sector, making sure that there is a retaining of talent once it gets into tech spaces. I think one of the things that we need to tackle and be more cognizant of in our conversations as women leaders in these spaces, is that we have all gone through something that may have shifted or made us second guess, why are we here? What are we doing? I think that having those candid conversations mitigates a little bit of stress, fatigue, or uncertainties individuals who are new in the tech sector might be experiencing. I think that it really furthers this mentality of collective work and responsibility in making sure that the spaces of advocacy and support, again, in rooms where that did not exist once upon a time, are preserved. And I also think it mitigates this false reality of you have to wear all of these hats and be a powerhouse and go, 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 and without knowing that there are others who are behind you, there are others who are interested in infiltrating this space, who may have had difficulties navigating or connecting or building capital or driving innovative solutions in spaces where they may not have traditionally been given. And so I think being reflective, having those candid conversations, but making sure that we're real about some of the things that we've experienced or some of the hardships and hurdles that we've had to carry through in particularly the tech sector will really help to dismantle some of the issues or some of the challenges that we have scaling talent that is traditionally underrepresented in this particular sector. It's something that I've experienced myself. I've had leaders, and not in Intel, but I've had leaders tell me, you know, oh, well, get over it. You're going to face this. This is the norm. And that normalizing of just the conflicts that you may face as an individual who is identifying as of an underrepresented demographic is problematic. I think it creates a false sense of reality for what it means to have support, drive collective work and responsibility on driving tech equity, as well as diversity and inclusion efforts in our organizations, whether or not it's private or public sector.
Agreed.
So I wanted to, if I can jump in with something. Dana, I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, and I have to say, just as a bit of a personal story, I got into diversity and inclusion because I come from a different country. So I'm an immigrant, which is not really hardly counts as diversity. Plus I'm a European immigrant. So that's actually ultra privilege, right? But I remember, I have a daughter who's now 30 years old. I've watched some of the issues that she had as a woman in finance. But eventually what happened is that I would go to these meetings, like, big conferences in tech, and like everybody looked like me. And then there would be a session on how do we get more Black people in tech. And I would go into the room, and there were two things that struck me. The first was that I was the only white guy in the room. Maybe there were two, right? Maybe three. And that just seemed wrong. But the other thing that really struck me was that I would hear stories like some of the ones that Genesis has shared, right? Of just the most incredibly painful experiences that people have because of the skin, the color of their skin, or because of their gender, or because of whether or not they have disability. And these were like touching people in a very direct way. But then when it came to discussing solutions, a little bit like we're doing right now, it was all about very high level things. We need to change the system. We need to, overthrow governments or change, education. And I always felt like there's a big disconnect there. And it made me feel like you either have to be an activist or do nothing. And then I realized that something clicked, which is that a lot of the work that I've been doing for almost 25 years before then, that was 5 years ago, had to do with understanding and quantifying the connection between the individual and the social context in which they operate, whether it's a company or it's a society or a city or whatever the case might be. And so I came up with this system, with a way of quantifying effectively how diversity and inclusion impacts individual people and how that percolates through the entire company. And as a result of that, that's given me a couple of really keen insights that has made it possible to do something that I take full advantage of my privilege, which is that I can get in front of a room of white male CEOs that are part of that old boys network, and I can explain to them in terms that are not grounded in the justice of it. They're not grounded in the fairness of it, even though I believe in those issues. They're grounded in the reasons why it would be stupid for them not to do the things that I'm suggesting to them that they do. And that's something that I feel incredibly privileged to have been able to uncover something like that. And I think it's so absolutely important. And one of the things, just to give you a very quick glimpse of that, one of the most important revelations that we've had that really, I think, reflects with what both Genesis and Eric have said, is that it's not enough just to try to attract talent. It's not enough to make that pipeline bigger. You actually have to retain that talent. And to us, what that made us realize is that the diversity is one piece, but inclusion, we always talk about diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the fact is 99% of the data that we get, 99% of how we measure performance, 99% of the initiatives that we work on are focused on diversity. And not just diversity, but representation, which I find problematic, right? I heard a recent talk by Stephanie Lemkin, who pointed out that the EEO1 form that every company uses to report their diversity data is 50 years old. intersectionality does not exist in the planet, right? So what we realize is that actually inclusion, specifically the experiences of making sure that people are able to do their work without having interferences because of their personal characteristics, is actually at least as crucial, if not more crucial, than diversity. And that's something that's been revolutionary, because what we're doing is we're going to people and saying, it's not about you need to support Black people or women or members of the LGBTQIA plus community. It's really about, you need to make sure that you're not letting anybody in your company feel excluded, because if they're feeling excluded, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You basically have people in your company that are not performing as well as you are. And so I do see a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. I think that having people, and by the way, Genesis, you referred to, you said it's important to have allies. I have to say, I almost dislike the term ally, because I kind of feel like, if I was a thief and came to your house and robbed you blind, and on the way out, I spilled over a can of soda and I stopped to pick it up and clean up, would you say, oh, thank you so much, you're my ally because you cleaned up the can of soda, right? I mean, white people, and I can say this because I'm one of them, we are the problem, right? Racism is not a Black person problem, it's a white person problem. Sexism is not a woman problem, it's a man problem. And so until those of us that have been fortunate enough to be able to kind of finally understand that a little bit, until we get up and actually do something about it and speak a language that the people like that will understand, I don't think that things are going to always necessarily change. But so I do have a bit of optimism, and I hope that some of the things that we're uncovering will help to get kind of the other side of the, of that fence to understand things a little bit better.
Right. And, Paolo, it's refreshing to hear your perspective. I wish we had more white men who could champion diversity and inclusion the way that you have craftily articulated. I think for me, in operating in the context of multiple multinational companies and banks throughout my professional tenure, I choose allyship because there are not a lot of white men in the system who cannot understand the greater context of the empathy, the collective work and responsibility, the impact, whether or not it's health ramifications, economic ramifications, safety ramifications, in the broader scope of creating a bottom line approach to driving a business. So allyship is a term that I use because it is familiar for a lot of people who are detached but want to show up. And I think it is a great call out to sort of retrain ourselves in how we use that term in, just acknowledging or pushing or encouraging folks who are not traditionally underrepresented to rethink their engagement and their need to support a cause for greater humanity, not just underrepresented peoples, but for the progression, the success of local and global communities. So just want to put a call out there, and thank you for challenging us, and thank you for seeding that encouragement to push people to want to be integrated into solving the problem.
Wow, okay. Let's see. I think we've gotten to the point where I want to read this quote from Melinda Gates. She said, when we invest in women and girls, we are investing in the people who invest in everyone else. And I love that quote because I think it summarizes exactly womanhood. In the COVID context, and when it has to do with technology, it's got me thinking about women in the traditional roles of caring for the family, and maybe the virtual learning is going on because school is closed, and your grandparents are learning to use Zoom and FaceTime, something that they probably weren't interested in doing before, just to stay connected with family members. Technology is traditionally how we solve problems, and I feel like COVID-19 might be that opportunity that's there to show how technology can change the world for the better. Is this Pollyanna thinking? What is happening? What can we do to draw on this moment and turn it into a movement, to think about how to use technology to change the world for the better and educate on diversity and inclusion and equity issues?
I'm not touching that one. I think, Erica, we haven't heard from you in a bit. What's...
Well, I think it goes, it's not Pollyanna, right? And I think I'm probably saying the same thing kind of over and over, and that like the notion that any change that is going to happen when we are educating and looking to change our systems. And so like this is the touchback, feel like it's a little bit cyclical conversation, is that quite frankly in many cases, as wonderful as our education system's been, it hasn't included real, true, accurate, hard information about inequities. And so some folks are just truly opening their eyes to that space, right? So let's put that there. And but I think the notion that this space right now where we're in is there are a few companies, right? And so it's almost like the pilot projects. We have a few large companies, and I will say Intel, I know being one of them that is like leading in the space. And that what my hope is that the pressure from 2020 are causing companies to rethink what they're doing, and then we'll apply some pressure, right? If we can catch it while it's hot, before it fizzles out and people go back to whatever the normal life and existence is, that there will be some change, but without applied pressure, I am afraid that we do a little bit of a slide back. We will see some improvements, and I will say this one notion I think we haven't spoken on, despite all the challenges of COVID and most of us working remotely who are not deemed essential, right? There's this other place. We've seen companies being forced to pivot to use technology in a different way that will allow even the essential workers to benefit and use technology. There are a number of organizations that we're still struggling with remote work as an option, which we know is beneficial to any caregiver, to often aging populations that have other caregiver responsibilities or need to take time. So I think that the upside is that there are companies that are being forced to change, and what we're hoping is that those companies are going to grow and do well and apply pressure to their peers. So that was kind of that's my 2.5 cents on that.
Okay. Listen, we've got 10 minutes left. There was a question in the audience. Someone was basically describing something terrible, that they were looking for software developers, and something came up about women, being difficult to work with, and maybe it's just easier to go with guys. What do we do about these stereotypes? Do you try to address the on the education side, the young people who are coming into the tech sector, on how to deal with that, and how to combat that? Or what do we do? What do we do about the stereotypes about women in tech? And is there anything we can do as individuals, or what should corporations be doing to address that broader issue?
I want to jump in there for US-based folks. I would say this is where we look at different levers, where we're talking about diversity, you're talking about inclusion and equity and compliance. But the compliance piece is where you're awfully close to EEO violations in that space, right? So, right? And so that is a massively important tool. And organizations need to do a baseline. Folks like to jump to implicit bias and microaggressions and awareness, but at the very baseline, in terms of your compliance piece, are you really truly creating a workplace that is free of discrimination, where you're holding managers accountable, you're training them, providing the information, and your entire workforce, and holding them accountable, and especially if you're in New York, because the requirements and the covering is much more expansive than even the federal government. But in the US, you should certainly hopefully you have an HR or EEO professional in place where you say, I'd like you to know, right? And I often would say approach this as a collaboration with the company, that I think that this is something that is risky behavior. Maybe this person didn't mean it, but really saying this is you're awfully close to this particular type of violation. And I think that we should just be really mindful there. Because I mean, I'm saying awfully close, but that language says like you're being discriminatory based upon gender or gender identity. I would be remiss if I said any other fluff thing about, you know, like the second step is the, what do we do to change the mindset? But the other truth is you apply and you use the barriers and parameters that you have in place already. So I'm sorry, no, Genesis, you wanted to, I saw you
Yeah,
nod.
no. So now I'm putting on my employee and labor relations hat. That is exactly right. There are extensive processes that a lot of multinational companies have around just being aware of policies and guidelines that are EEOC, how we think about just in general, where is the dividing line between, you know, keeping companies legal in compliance, and then making room to have diverse representation and a space for people to bring them their full selves to work. It's a balancing act, but I think the processes and the policies that are in place often are triggered as reactive, where they're sort of used or implemented in response to an action happening. I think where there's opportunity for companies, nonprofit organizations, government agencies, is to really integrate a culture evolution to mitigate and be proactive about addressing that diversity and inclusion implicit bias that might exist or come into the workplace. I can speak to a multitude of companies or organizations that I work for. This is a space where, again, there needs to be emphasis on culture, so that there is a proactive expectation or accountability lever to say, this is what we do not tolerate as an organization. We are centered around diversity and inclusion and equity. And these are the efforts that we are trying to drive to be an inclusive workforce. And I think if more companies and organizations can have a zero tolerance policy in that regard and embed that philosophy in the cultural attributes that it's driving for whatever initiative that they're trying to lead, I think the more we can see proactive ways of mitigating and reducing and holding folks accountable to showing up in an inclusive and responsible way.
Okay. I think something we don't talk about often, yes, there's a lot of talk about coding and, you know, highly skilled technical jobs, but one of the questions was about lower skilled workers and entry level types of training. Is there any focus on that? What's happening in like the, I guess, junior high, middle school, maybe high school? What's happening in terms of getting women and girls interested in technology careers and maybe supporting those low skill jobs, data entry? I mean, with COVID, you're working from home, maybe you have children at home you need to be with. Is there a push to get more people trained in that area? Anything about that?
Well, one thing that I wanted to point out is, and this is in a way almost the opposite of something I said earlier, which is that the need to focus on specific things. But I think that as opposed to trying to address really large problems, but one of the problems that I've seen, and I remember back in the 80s when I was in an undergraduate going to graduate school, and I was for a while I dated a woman who was doing her master's in computer science. At the time, there were probably 40 to 50% of the women in that department with this at the University of Colorado Boulder were women, and that's changed pretty dramatically, as you all know. And I think that without again trying to move the blame to somebody else, I think that there has been one of the factors certainly has been the kind of the bro culture that we've seen becoming so prevalent in a lot of tech companies, which is terrible and it should not be tolerated. But also a lot of it has to do with even things like the media and entertainment industry, and the fact that we are bombarded with images. And this, by the way, this is true of women in tech, but it's also true certainly if you think about a lot of the issues that we have with race, a lot of the issues that we have with mass incarceration. the war on drugs that was started in the 1980s, and the fact that basically we were presented Black people as being criminals, right? I mean, that's, basically the media massively forced that kind of image upon us. So I do think that we have to be aware of the fact that a lot of these issues manifest themselves in terms of biases within organizations. But unfortunately, very often they have roots in the fact that there are people that just simply, a lot of young women that may not realize that there's even an opportunity for them. And this is true of people of color as well. In fact, Intel, Genesis, I worked about maybe 3 years ago with one of your colleagues who was doing this great program to try to reach into middle schools, to try to educate them. And this person that I was talking to was commenting on how there are entire communities just like a mile away from Intel or a couple miles away from Intel that are predominantly Latinx and, or other kinds, sometimes other people of color, that they don't even know that Intel exists, or that they don't even think of that as being a potential employer for them, because there's nobody in their family that has jobs there, because they never see people like them in movies that are represented as being part of these startups, et cetera. So yeah, I think it is important that we start thinking at the same time about the internal problems that we're having, but also start thinking about what can we do as individuals, boycott movies that are not, or maybe rather than boycott movies, start watching movies that represent different kinds of people. And by the way, I realize that this is more a message for people who look like me than otherwise. But it's so important that we really look at society as a whole and how it impacts things that ultimately appear to be technology issues, but they're not necessarily, tech industry issues.
Genesis or Erica, anything? Okay. We've got 5 minutes left. We covered a lot tonight. Can we give each panelist, take a minute and a half to think about what you want our audience to leave with from tonight? The audience is diverse. People are interested in different things. But if you had to think of one item you want them to leave with and what they gained from tonight, what would that be?
Well, I'm happy to go since everybody else is waiting there. I'm just going to ask one thing. I didn't talk about it a lot, but there's this issue of this connection between diversity and inclusion. And I think that as long as we continue to focus our efforts strictly on numerical representation, I think that that's really not going to be very helpful. And I use this analogy, it's a bit of a joke, but I tell people, it's like, oh, the other day was really cold and my wife came in and said, oh, honey, it's so cold, look, the thermostat reads 50 degrees. And I said, oh, I'll fix that. And I lit a match under the thermostat. Meanwhile, the windows are cracked, the doors are open, and the roof is leaking. And, we have a saying in our company that, and again, not everybody has the same definitions, but we like to think that diversity is what you see, inclusion is what you do, and equality is ultimately what you get. So I think it's fundamentally important that we learn to move beyond just counting heads and representation, and recognize that unless we learn to embrace people for who they are and really truly integrate, that needle is going to continue not to move, just like it has not moved for the last 50 years.
Thank you, Paolo. I'd like to say that often when I'm having conversations like these, I'm typically preaching to the choir. I'm sure all of you are passionate about work in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, providing opportunities, or else you wouldn't be on this call today. This is, and I have actually a quote. It's something that, I hold near and dear to myself, knowing that representation fatigue is a real thing. When we are often doing this work as women, again, as a woman of color and as a woman with a disability, we often are called on to solution build. We are often called on to be the voice in a room, and that can be exhausting. And so the quote that I have, and it's by one of my favorite feminist poets, Nayyirah Waheed, it says, "I love myself, the quietest, simplest, most powerful revolution ever." And I'd say the one takeaway that I would like to share with everyone on this call as advocates, as champions, of diversity and inclusion, take care of yourself. This is hard and meaningful and impactful work. And often we get swept into giving and giving and giving and developing solutions and knocking on doors and being trailblazers, that we don't take time for healing, for space, and for acknowledgement that this is heavy work. And so if it's one thing that I'd like for all of you who are in this boat of pushing forward diversity and inclusion and equity efforts in the tech sector, be kind to yourself. You have a community. Ali, please feel free to send out my contact information. Leverage that community for support. Because the more we can create spaces of healing for ourselves, the more work we can do and the more we can amplify this connection to move those systemic issues and barriers that a lot of people face in tackling diversity and inclusion in the workforce.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to, I would add to that the sentiment of twofold. If you are in an organization that is looking to take this on, that understanding that, again, the diversity are the numbers, but the sense of equity and belonging is something completely different. And to investigate your culture and climate means that you have to start asking more questions. And so in that, I want to share two resources: GARE, the Government Alliance on Race Equity, and the Management Center out of Washington, D.C. The Management Center does not offer free trainings, but they have a plethora of free resources on their site. One of those is from GARE, and it discusses something called choice points. And choice points is where you apply a lens that says, ask new questions, ask more. Is this the way that this has to be done because it's the way it's always been done? Do we recruit from this place? Do we have to hire at this degree level? What are the systems for promotion? It really is a question that it is a process of using choice points that has you question everything about your programs, policies, and initiatives. And only in the questioning do you discover the gaps. And in those gaps, you build bridges to create a better sense of belonging.
You don't know what you don't know. Well, on that note, oh my God, I have to thank all of you for an amazing panel discussion. As for me, as the founder of Do Right Enterprises, where I'm focused on diversifying STEM education, I just know I'm going to be the best me I can be. I'm going to encourage everyone to do the same. And I'm going to start at home because, yes, the country needs a transformative process. Our neighborhoods needs transformation. But what I'm going to do as an individual is start at home. I want to say peace and blessings to everyone and happy holidays. Allie?
Yeah, I just want to close out. We're a little bit over time, but I'm so appreciative of everyone coming here tonight, and I'm so appreciative of the panelists and our moderator. I recognize the topic that you're given is so large. There's so many things to talk about. There's so much to learn. There has been some really great resources that are in the link, that are in the chat. So, I'll stay on a little bit longer. So if you have any resources or thoughts, this conversation is just the beginning. We were only able to touch on a few different things, but I'm so appreciative and in awe of, everyone, all of our panelists, our moderator. So just want to thank you so much for coming tonight. And yes, again, I will try to get to all the questions that are in here, but if you have more resources, put them in there and I will send them. Everyone will get this in their newsletter later, along with any other resources we've collected at Social Builder. So thank you all so much. Have a lovely rest of your evening. Thank you again, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.